Topic Notes 1.5, Density and Pressure. If you want to experience just how powerful the ocean is, go out to sea and swim straight down. Very quickly, you'll feel pain as the air spaces in your ears get squeezed by the mounting pressure. You can equalize and keep going, but the light begins to dim and the world looks completely blue. The water is denser than air, allowing you to feel like you're flying as you swim. But there is no refuge for your lungs, which demand to breathe. You must return to the surface, for we can only be brief visitors in this place. These are some pictures of me out freediving, and it really is quite spectacular to be in this big blue void. The density and pressure that we're going to be talking about today has large ramifications for marine life, for how the ocean is layered, and of course for our own experiences in the water. So let's get started. So here are the main ideas for today. Density is a measure of the mass of a defined volume of water and is affected by temperature, pressure, and salinity. Density differences help to maintain temperature and salinity gradients in the ocean, which affect the distribution of organisms. Density is the measure of how much mass there is in a given volume, essentially how much stuff is in there. The equation is D equals m over v. And in the image here, you can see two square boxes about equal volume. The box on the left has less molecules in it than the box on the right. So the box on the right is a higher density. So why do we care about density anyway? Well, let's first address what is the water column. The water column is a vertical section of water from the surface to the bottom, and it's a useful concept when discussing changes in abiotic factors within the body of water, specifically density, because higher density water sinks below less dense water. You can actually see this in the diagram below, where you have low density water in the yellow bag in the beaker to the left. And as you go across to the beaker on the right, that green bag has higher density water in it, and thus it sinks to the bottom. Now, temperature, salinity, and pressure all play roles in determining the density of water. So let's look at temperature first. Increased temperature increases the volume and thus decreases the density. That's kind of a lot, so let's unpack it. Essentially, we're talking about molecular motion when we talk about temperature, right? As you increase temperature, you increase molecular motion, and as you do that, there's more space between molecules as they're vibrating around. That means that there's less molecules per unit volume, thus the density decreases. Now, warmer water, because of that less density, the decreased density, floats near the surface. Essentially, it's shallow. It's exposed to heating of the sun, which warms it up, and may reach up to 25 degrees Celsius or higher. Lots of graphs today. If you look at these two graphs kind of paired up together, the line on the left is the density. It's called the pycnocline, which we'll get into in a bit. But you notice that the density is lower in the surface waters and it gets higher as you go deeper. Now, if you look at the temperature or the thermocline over on the right, you'll notice that the temperature is much warmer in the surface waters and it gets colder as you go deeper. In reverse, decreased temperature decreases volume and increases density. So essentially, cold, dense water is found below the surface water, likely to be around 1 degree Celsius at depths of about 200 meters or more. So now let's talk about pressure. Pressure and density increase with depth, which makes sense. As you're sitting on the surface, before you even get underwater, you're essentially experiencing 1 atmosphere of pressure, the pressure of the entire atmosphere pushing down on you. Now, as human beings, we're kind of calibrated to that, so we don't really feel it. But as you go deeper, every 10 meters or so, you are adding another whole atmosphere worth of pressure on you, which is why as you go deeper, that pressure increases. That's why you feel the squeeze in the air spaces in your ears and things like that. Essentially, the deeper you go, the higher the pressure. Now, approximately 2% increase in density occurs from the surface to the abyssal floor. So essentially, density is tied to this pressure, although it doesn't change dramatically due to the pressure. Now, salinity has a bit more of an impact compared to pressure. As salinity increases, density increases. So essentially, you're putting salts in the water, it puts more stuff in the water, so the mass of the water increases. So fresher water tends to be lower density, and it's going to float over higher density salt water. Now, if you look at salinity profiles in terms of depth, there's a change with latitude in terms of salinity. And this is due to a number of factors like temperature, precipitation, and evaporation in these different regions where you're going to have higher or lower salinities based on how much evaporation occurs. So if you look in the subtropics, you tend to have a lot of evaporation, and thus you tend to get a little bit higher salinity. Whereas in equatorial regions, you do have that high evaporation, but you also have a lot of rain, and so it brings it down a bit. In the polar latitudes, you tend to have lower salinity in the surface waters. Ocean layers are formed based on density differences caused primarily by temperature and salinity. As we see, pressure doesn't have as much of an influence, but temperature and salinity are big players here. Now, let's start at the top. At the surface, you have a surface mixed zone, which extends down to about 200 meters, or around 656 feet, and it's warmed by solar heating, and it's well mixed. Now, if you go a bit deeper, between 200 and 1,000 meters, we're in the transition zone, and this is where a lot of things start to change. And this is where those labels we were talking about before, thermocline, halocline, pycnocline, come into play. Thermocline is the zone of rapid temperature change, usually decreasing with depth. And this happens in this transition zone. And you can see that in the far left graph. Now, similarly, the rapid salinity change is called a halocline, and the a change in density essentially is called a pycnocline. Now, all three of these are related because thermocline and halocline deal with temperature and salinity, and those are really the major controllers for density. Now, below 1,000 meters, we have relatively stable conditions, relatively stable and constant salinity and temperature, and thus stable density. Generally, the saltiest water is found nearest the seabed. Now, the ocean layers can be mixed. For example, strong wind, wave action due to storms, currents, and upwelling can all kind of upturn things. And this mixing can cause thermoclines and haloclines to break down and change. Now, interestingly enough, this is actually really important to marine productivity, and we're going to talk about that in a bit, but essentially just a little preview. Nutrients are usually trapped in the deep water, and the only way to get them up is to mix those density layers and bring some of that deeper nutrient-rich water to the surface. So let's look at some of the variations in density within the ocean. Now, when we're dealing with the open ocean, temperature is the major player here. For example, in the tropics, between around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, you have very high surface temperatures that create very high evaporation rates. This makes the water relatively salty, but it still stays at the surface because of how warm it is. Now, this is really important because this creates a density barrier for that cooler, nutrient-rich water deeper. And it really means that the upper water tends to be warm, but also nutrient poor. Now, in the polar regions, the temperature gradient is much less dramatic, and it's much more consistent across the board. And you can see that on the graph towards the right. Now, remember, temperature is more important in that open ocean. And in the North Atlantic, we actually have a scenario where even though it's lower salinity, because of how cold it is, the density causes that water to sink. And that actually is essentially the start of what we call thermohaline circulation, or deep water currents that go throughout the globe. And again, that's something we're going to click into in another lecture down the line, but just laying some seeds here to talk about later. Now, near shore, that's where salinity is the largest factor in terms of density. That's because near shore, you have a lot of access to fresh water that might run off from land. Evaporation is working on a much smaller volume of water because it's shallower. And the mixing is very dramatic because you're not talking about deep water. And so salinity becomes a much larger factor here compared to temperature a little bit farther offshore. So there's one other variation that I'd like to talk about, and that has to do with water freezing. So why does water at the bottom of the ocean not actually freeze, even though it's really cold down there? So these are some answers to that. First of all, increased salinity decreases the freezing point. It's part of those kind of features that occur due to that hydrogen bonding and dissolving salts into the water and how that changes the chemistry of stuff. Now, as water freezes, hydrogen bonds form that lattice work, decreasing the density, making ice essentially float, so it goes towards the surface. Now think about it. If water actually froze from the bottom up, marine life would have no refuge. They would essentially be stuck, right? So ice on the surface actually forms essentially a thermal insulation layer. And that's really important for a lot of considerations, not just the ocean, but if you think about maybe a lake or a pond that freezes over in the winter, but it allows the water underneath the ice to stay liquid for the fish and other aquatic life that might be there. So floating ice also provides habitats for animals, penguins, walruses, polar bears, depending on which pole you're at, things like that. And the underside of ice sheets provide habitat for phytoplankton and algae that essentially maintain the food web. It's really kind of interesting and a lot of cool stuff to be learned still in the icy polar regions. All right, remember those main ideas, right? Density is a measure of the mass of defined volume of water and is affected by temperature, pressure, and salinity. And of course, density differences help to maintain temperature and salinity gradients in the oceans, which affect the distribution of marine organisms. And of course, make sure you're paying attention to all those learning goals provided as well. Till next time, keep learning.